Enterprise Management 360.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Tech Chat. Now, in this week's episode, I'll be speaking to Shashi Kiran, who is the Chief Marketing and Product Officer at Aryaka Networks. So, Shashi, welcome to the show and thank you for joining me.
It's good to be back, Max.
Exactly. You and me did a podcast back in, I believe it was February now, and we were talking about cloud-first SD-WAN adoption and how that can be advantageous. So it's great to really be able to speak to you again and pick your brains a little bit more. And in this week's episode, we're going to be talking about Aryaka's fourth global State of the WAN report, which has just been released. And the report surveyed over 1,000 network and IT practitioners to really get a better understanding of the state of WAN. So with that in mind, the report had some really kind of interesting barriers for SD-WAN adoption. So from your perspective, what are these barriers and how can organizations really overcome them?
Yeah, so this was a really good report in terms of the demographics that it surveyed, and we went deep into different geographies. It was a global survey of sorts. What we also did, not just take a look at SD-WAN, which happens to be a component of the overall WAN transformation initiative, but rather look at the barriers to WAN transformation holistically. And some of the things that really surprised us was one of the big barriers was complexity, right? And you would think that over the last 2 to 3 years, with the increased adoption of a lot of these transformative technologies, you would drive towards simplicity. But it looked like, complexity was a very big barrier in terms of making that shift happen. And we dissected that a bit as well. And in general, I think application performance was one of the top care-abouts and the problem statements that enterprises were looking to solve. And we also did some compare and contrast between the applications that were moving to the cloud, what kind of barriers were they experiencing there, a do-it-yourself model versus a managed model. So it was sort of good to see the wide variety of responses coming in. But surprisingly for us, compared to last year, where cost was a bit of a consideration, particularly for those moving into new technologies, there was a bit of disruption involved. And so cost was a bit of top of mind. This year, it seemed to be that complexity was number one.
So if we take that a little bit further, what are the current expectations of people implementing SD-WAN, especially in the current climate with the fixed versus remote worker situation?
Yeah, so this is an interesting dynamic. And I think the remote workers situation has come up in such a way that nobody anticipated it to happen so dramatically and so abruptly. Nowadays, I kind of talk about the definition of SD-WAN as SD is social distancing and WAN is work anywhere now, right? So you really need to have the flexibility to work from anywhere and be productive. But really what we saw was organizations had to dramatically shift their business as well as operational models. And for those who were fortunate enough to do so, they could have workers, teleworking and then contribute in some way. But there were businesses that really weren't geared up for any sort of remote working. And I think from a WAN perspective, if you start to look at what this means, it means you need to have more flexibility. We have seen the adoption of technologies like SD-WAN as organizations adopt cloud applications and cloud delivered models. I believe it's going to accelerate further, and you're going to see a greater adoption of cloud. You're going to see more movement towards SaaS, and all of these are, by the way, in line with what we have seen in the State of the WAN survey report that you alluded to as well.
Yeah, and I 100% agree. A lot of the conversations I'm having at the moment is that cloud adoption, and people who haven't acted already are already thinking, I've got to get to that position, because this wasn't in kind of the business continuity plan. This wasn't in the steps that was needed. So a lot of people are kind of accelerating that adoption. So I think you're right. We're going to see a massive increase over the next 6 months to a year. And I'm glad you brought up flexibility there, because that's obviously another massive element of what we're talking about as well. So how important is that flexibility when it comes to offering security, and how should that be approached?
Yeah, so if you look at the motions that happened in the last decade or so, the move to SaaS services, the move to cloud, the move to subscription models, all of these happened either because of convenience reasons or cost reasons, and what I see now happening is they are now going to accelerate because they're good for managing change. And so change management is never easy. It's a very disruptive function depending on what kind of change you're dealing with and what kind of resources do you have to throw at managing the change. So organizations prefer inertia unless there is a trigger to change. And so to get away from inertia, when you're forced to do so, in the case of this current situations where they had to get into a lockdown mode on almost an overnight and then shift to sort of a remote worker model where architectures weren't suited for peak remote access capacity, right? So they had to be very creative in how they handle the situation. And now there is this understanding that, look, we may be susceptible to more of these coming in. And typically you plan for business continuity as saying, hey, my WAN link goes down, do I have a backup service provider? You don't think that all your global offices are suddenly going to be in a lockdown mode overnight. Nobody has kind of planned for that kind of contingency, but that's the need of the day, right? And so I believe now as we look at some of these newer architectures, the flexibility has to deal with how set up are you to manage change. How adaptable is your architecture? Allow you to shift your business operational models very quickly. And so that is in the context of not just business continuity, but also in terms of time to market, in terms of competitive landscape. Because everybody is trying to see what is the edge they can get in terms of really getting a leg up on competition. And so these are all things that will become important. Cost certainly, but cost is really de-risk when you go to OpEx subscription-based models. It's not as if you're going to go all in with the CapEx approach first. So that's sort of taken out of the equation. The second is the convenience, and there you need to really look at which model is more suited to you and your organization. There is also the multi-cloud trend happening, right? So you don't want to get into one cloud provider. You're trying to right-size it to the kind of applications that your organization is running. And then there is the alignment with the change management, adaptability, flexibility. How do you kind of navigate uncertain times? And so now I think viewing it from that perspective, and you look at it in the context of the overall digital transformation initiative, these are the factors that will sort of come to play.
Yeah, there's so many factors that an organization needs to factor in, isn't there? And then so many elements to make all of this work and truly have that kind of digital transformation. So it is interesting to see that kind of progression. So with that, Shashi, all I can say is thank you very much for joining us on this week's episode of Tech Chat. There's so much in this report, and it's a really well researched and well done piece, and the information that you guys have been able to gain from it, I think, is beneficial to a lot of organizations. So anyone who is looking to go down this route is definitely a report that they should be looking at.
Well, thank you, Max. This report is available on our website. You can download it. We'll also have printed copies available. And I think the key thing is if you're looking to plan your WAN, as we say it, right, at least over the course of the next 2 to 4 years, the insights that you can glean from this report are going to be guideposts as you go about doing it. So please feel free to download. It's a free asset that you can get your hands on. And Max, as always, good to be on your show, and thank you for having me.
Of course, it's been a pleasure. Hopefully we can have another chat down the road. So Shashi, thank you very much. And thank you everyone who took the time to watch this. Do make sure you go check out the report. We'll include the link down below for you guys to check out as well. We'll be back next week with another episode in our Tech Chat series. In the meantime, make sure you go follow us on all our social channels, which is at EM360 on Twitter and LinkedIn. And of course, for more great content, make sure you head on over to em360tech.com. Now, just before you go, I wanted to let you know about a virtual event that is coming up. Deep Learning World is coming live from Las Vegas, emanating out of Caesars Palace from May 31st to June 4th. This premier conference is covering the commercial deployment of deep learning, so make sure you register at deeplearningworld.com to have access to fantastic workshops, insightful speakers, and groundbreaking sessions.